Hey, what's going on, guys? Today we're going to be ranking all of the areas in Lies of P from worst to best, all 11 of them. Now, the criteria for this is based on how good the level design actually is, how the areas look aesthetically, how good the bosses are, if it actually changes anything up from what we've previously seen in the game itself. So basically everything. Now, this list is going to be based on my personal preferences, obviously, so it is going to be very subjective. So a lot of you guys will end up disagreeing with what I actually have to say. And if that is the case, that means that you're just literally wrong. I'm kidding. Just let me know down in the comments what your opinions are. Now, starting off at the bottom, we have area number 10. Now, this is the secret area, of which is underneath the Hotel Krat. And for a secret area, it doesn't really do anything that special or unique. The area looks pretty basic and plain. The level design is very simplistic. It is a very short area as well. That's filled in with like a bunch of just enemies we've already fought. Even the boss itself is just a reskinned boss of what we fought previously in the game. And arguably, this is just the worst boss in the entire game as well. I just wish they made it look a little bit more magical, being that it is like a secret hidden area. And if it actually did tie in directly into the last area as well, so having it be separate from the entire game, that would actually be really cool. But at the moment, it is a very forgettable section of the game. At number 10, we have Area 9. And now this is just the reskinned version of the Krat Central Station, which is the first area in the game. But this time we're coming back to it to notice that it's all destroyed and collapsed, which aesthetically speaking actually does look kind of cool. But I did wish that for some of the sections they went a bit harder in terms of how destroyed that it actually does look. But for the reasons as to why I don't really care for this area much, is that one, half the level design is basically the exact same thing of what we're actually experiencing in the first chapter. And as for the other half, it doesn't really change up too much. It is very linear design. And they basically added their own version of like a Deathblight swamp. I remember making the joke that the Elden Ring DLC is going to add a Deathblight swamp. And I literally kind of did it in this game in the version of the Disruption Crystals, which in regular New Game doesn't really do too much, but in New Game Plus and beyond, with the status effects just dramatically increased, it doesn't turn into the most fun experience, let me tell you that. And even when you get to the final boss of the area, it's just a reskinned version of the very first boss that you fight, and it doesn't really change up too much as well. I kind of feel like they were running out of assets in this game to just design a whole brand new area, so they just decided to just come back to the beginning again. Which I guess is a fine idea, but I didn't feel like it was executed as well as it could have been. Number 9, we have Area 1. Now, this area doesn't really do anything bad at all. It is the starting area in the game, and it does a really good job at just introducing you to all the different types of mechanics and the aesthetic of the game itself, because it literally is just a tutorial, and it does a really good job at being a tutorial. Even the final boss isn't anything too grand or amazing, it's just a very basic, simple fight, but it does a really good job at introducing you to all the gameplay elements as well. But being how simple the level design is and all the enemies are, it can't really get anything higher than this. Number 8, we have Area 11, which is the final area in the game, which honestly has some really high highs, but it has some really low lows, and for the final area, it is very disappointing that this is the case. I just feel like the second half of the game in general just had a fall off in terms of its level design, and I wish they kind of picked back up with the final area, and they didn't really do that. But to start off with, this area is just separated from everything else in the entire game for some reason. I wish it was kind of all connected still. But I actually was excited to first arrive here because it actually had a different scenery compared to everything else that you saw in the game in this wide open beach. But unfortunately, you just run through the entire thing and there's like no enemies in sight until you reach the gate front, to which you're welcomed with this ridiculous army of carcasses that you basically serve zero purpose in fighting because there's just no benefit to it at all. So after you just run straight past them, you end up getting to the Gatekeeper enemy boss, of which is a very bad boss fight. It's just not that fun in general. It's just a damage sponge. He doesn't really have a cool moveset or anything like that. Doesn't feel like a fun fight. Then after you finish this very long and obnoxious boss fight, you kind of feel tired and not really excited to explore the last area in the game. And even when you do, it doesn't really offer much different to what you already fought previously in the game in terms of enemies, because they're all pretty much the exact same thing. Even the level design is still pretty basic. All a bunch of narrow passageways. There are some highs in the level design in terms of how different the areas actually do look, and the enemy placements actually can be kind of unique. But once you get later on, there's such complicated and convoluted types of levels and dungeons that just feel extremely obnoxious to explore and don't really feel much of a benefit in trying to clear out those areas because they just decide to put the most annoying enemies all in one room together. But thankfully, the bosses in these areas are actually kind of decent after the Gatekeeper, at least in Luxasia, the Nameless Puppet especially. Simon Manus isn't too bad. He could have been a better boss fight, but for the most part, he's okay. I do like his boss arena, and like the entire moment leading up to that area is actually kind of cool. But speaking of boss arenas, I wish that the Nameless Puppet boss arena was actually a lot better than what it actually is. It does feel very basic for like the secret final hidden boss. It could have been more of a magical moment and more magical scenery, but it just is a very bland looking area, which I feel like a lot of Area 11 ends up being this. Like, if you're going to separate this from the rest of the game, at least make it aesthetically different. But for the most part, I think this is just a massive missed opportunity. Number 7, we have Area 8, which is the Barren Swamp, which is one of the many poison swamps in the game, and just like Souls games, you have to make the poison swamps as obnoxious as possible, and they did a really good job with this one here because the area is just big, wide open, a bunch of enemies, a couple of bosses while ballistas are just raining down arrows from the sky. It is very obnoxious. So honestly, you would just decide to just run straight through this entire section, but they kind of force you to go through this area by just littering the entire arena with really good rewards in the form of all these butterflies. The bosses drop quartz as well. But one thing this actually does really well is that it actually does force you to just progress through the area, and when it wraps back around, you actually can destroy the ballista, and at that point you actually can either choose to clear out the swamp itself or just progress onto the next area. So that type of level design is actually really good. But in the terms of the aesthetics of the area, the first half, it's kind of cool. It does feel like this puppet graveyard in the first section, and the second half feels like this weird carcass village that's just built onside the cliff. And in terms of the final boss in this area, I actually like this boss more than most actually do. I know a lot of people do not like it, but for me personally, I think it's really cool, but it is still very far from being one of the better bosses in the game. So yeah, for me, you can just get around about the middle of the pack. Number 6, we have Area 5. Now this is where the areas actually start to get pretty decent. For this section at least, the first part of it seems like it's a village that's been overrun by a bunch of these carcasses. And you can tell that this is the case because obviously they have these little huts and there's all these traps laid down on the ground. And the level design of this section is actually pretty cool as well, as it does all wrap around back to the beginning via that elevator that goes up to the hut. But as you progress forth, you end up going down to the Malum district, which does feel like another area that's been overrun by carcasses, but this time it's more of like a town. And the thing I actually like about this area is that aesthetically it looks different to almost everything else in the entire game, because this entire section is all like raining, it's been flooded. And this little section does do the same thing as the first half, and that it kind of just wraps back around in a circle as well in terms of its level design, which obviously is very welcomed. I do like shortcuts. But unfortunately, the thing that lowers it down for me is that although the level design does wrap around in a circle, it does feel very linear. It's just like one straight path all the way to the boss. And that the boss itself, I don't really care for it much. I don't like NPC fights. They seem pretty obnoxious and tedious to fight in my opinion. Specifically talking about the lackeys that surround the fight. The actual main boss itself is actually pretty decent. But definitely the best part about this area and this chapter itself is when you actually notice that it just wraps all the way back around to the Hotel Krat, which is just amazing, well-designed, like kind of on the same levels as Dark Souls 1. It's really cool. Number 5, we have Area 3. Now, this is definitely an area that needed to be in this game. Just having a cool workshop and seeing how all the puppets are actually made is very aesthetically pleasing. But not only does this area actually look really cool, but the level design is still really good as well. There's plenty of different branching paths. It actually does reward exploration a lot. Every single room actually does look different than the last. Actually adds new different types of puppets as well. Now, unfortunately, the level design doesn't really like wrap back around in a circle and have all these like interesting shortcuts like some of the other areas do. But honestly, it doesn't need it. It's just a really neat area, and it definitely nailed the aesthetic of a puppet workshop. Really good. Number 4, we have Area 7. Now this area houses the arcade and the grand exhibition gallery. Now starting off with the arcade, this is definitely one of the creepier looking areas in the game, with fighting all those carcass enemies in these dark corridors, and actually especially going downstairs to the basement of that weird swamp area. That's pretty creepy as well. Now this area does actually have a fair share of shortcuts that do wrap around back to the beginning. However, trying to navigate through this section is very complicated. It has all these different types of hallways that all look the exact same, and you have no idea which way you're really supposed to go. But they definitely did nail the horror theme of this area. But then the following section in the Grand Exhibition Gallery, that is completely different aesthetic to what you actually see in the arcade, as it's just overrun with puppets. But this area itself is actually really cool. Seeing like all the puppets of the future just shown in an exhibition kind of gives you a glimpse of what life was like before all this shit happened. But this whole section pretty much has everything that you want. Every single room kind of looks different than the last. It actually adds a bunch of new different types of puppets as well. You get to go fight inside, outside, in the rooftop, and all the areas that's wrapped back around in a nice circle as well. Good amount of shortcuts. And then it goes ahead and introduces a newer enemy, those crazy old men that have the Gatling guns, and there's really big guys that punch you and stuff. And then you get to the boss of the area, Champion Victor, which is just an absolute treat to fight. I love this boss fight so much. It is very cool from start to finish. Definitely check out my ranking of bosses list if you want to know more about my opinions of the bosses themselves. Number 3, we have Area 4. Now this is the cathedral area, and it starts off with you being in this village that's overrun by a bunch of puppets. It's actually very reminiscent of the Forbidden Wood section, because after you clear out that initial first part, you take the cart all the way up to the top, then all of a sudden, the game just turns into The Last of Us, because now you have to go through another village area, but this time it's overrun by a bunch of carcasses. And all of this ends up leading to this atmospheric moment of which you reach the bridge that leads on towards this big giant cathedral, and then once you enter inside the cathedral, you know some shit's about to go down, seeing the blood stains along the floor, and then you're just sitting there like, yep, okay, this is about to happen. We're now playing this type of game. And then you just walk walk into the next area, then you notice there's a poison swamp and all this weird type of architecture and these traps and stuff like that. Then you realize that this area is basically like a poisoned Last of Us Sen's Fortress looking shit, which honestly is an amazing idea. Look, me myself, I'm a masochist. I like platforming in the Souls games, so this is actually very fun for me. Definitely a W idea, of which aesthetically that is got perfect. And even when you head into the next section, you notice the cathedral is even more worn down and more crazy, with a whole bunch of different types more of carcasses as well. And it's all leading up to this boss, of which is the most disgusting looking boss that has an amazing design, by the way. Even though I don't really care much for the fight mechanically, this whole area definitely nailed its atmosphere. Number 2, we have area number 2. Now this is basically just the central Yharnam for Lies of P, because not only does it look very similar, but the level design is also just a big W. Area just has amazing exploration. You can scour the entire rooftops, go down to the streets, and everything that just feels so rewarding. Doesn't matter what type of room that you go into, it feels like you're gonna get something that's actually good. This area just has the right amount of shortcuts, adds a healthy amount of new enemies to fight. I'm pretty sure that everyone actually playing this game after going through this area knew instantly that they were gonna like it, 100%, because it just had everything that you needed. Even the final boss of this section was just an amazing boss fight to have early on. It was just so fun to fight and so fun to actually learn the mechanics and get good at this boss itself. Just a flawless area. Number 1, we have Area 6, which is just the pinnacle of the game. Everything just reaches its height at this point. The first half was so strong. Unfortunately, the second half, not as much. But Area 6 is basically Rosa Illabel Street and the Opera House. Starting off with Rosa Illabel Street, this is kind of just an extension of Area 2, basically. Now, I don't think the level design is going to be as masterful, but the areas do feel just as rewarding to explore. And this section actually is a little bit more challenging because obviously it's later in the game, so it kind of feels like a more cracked up version compared to Area 2. Especially when you go along that really long street that has that big rolling fireball coming down to where those enemies with the flamethrowers spawn in. That's just like a very cool section to just go through. And it all leads up to the Mad Clown Puppet boss fight, which is actually a pretty cool boss. Definitely has an amazing design, but definitely the Opera House is the main selling point of this area, because not only is it just aesthetically very pleasing, but the level design basically has everything that you want as well. Really cool and different areas to explore, right amount of shortcuts, adds new and different types of puppets that all look pretty cool as well. And it all leads to like the best boss in the entire game. I don't care what anybody says. The King of Puppets and Romeo is just a flawless boss fight in terms of its design, mechanics, music, everything. It's just really good. And then even after this section as well, after you kill the King of Puppets and going through that street again to where you notice all the puppets are just distraught and defeated because their king is now dead, is actually a really cool and atmospheric moment in the game. Anyway, that pretty much concludes it for this one. As always, please do like and subscribe, because we'll have a couple more Lies of P videos coming out along the way, probably up until Lords of the Fallen does come out, which will actually be next week. And definitely do follow me on Twitch, because I will be doing challenge runs of all the different types of Souls games as well. Anyway, see you guys in the next one. Bye.